So we've talked about the importance of physical security and how that can affect the digital security of your environment, the services that are running and the protection of data stored on storage arrays. But let's also talk about other aspects of that, which means environmental controls, because that in turn affects physical security of things like servers in a server room that will only run correctly at a certain temperature. We don't want them overheating, for instance. So airflow management is critical, just like it is in a residence, in an apartment complex, in a building, for work. We need to make sure airflow management is carefully considered because we need equipment to be able to breathe, so to speak, correctly. So we need to make sure that we keep incoming cool air that's used to cool down equipment in a server room or a data center, that incoming cool air, either from the outside or from an air conditioning unit, it needs to be kept separate from the warm air coming out of equipment that's being exhausted out of the back of equipment. Usually it's the back. So we need to draw in cool air to cool down equipment, and we need a mechanism to draw warm air out. And usually this means we have to think about keeping cold and warm air separate. We need some way to get cold air in the first place. Usually that means air conditioning. And we also need a way to draw warm air out, which usually means the use of fans. Now, another thing to think about in server rooms or in data centers is using what are called containment panels or curtains. Now, you might have thick rubber curtains, for example, that you install to separate parts of a server room or a data center to keep the airflow separate, the cool and the warm air that we were just talking about. We don't want cool incoming air to mix with warm air that needs to be exhausted out of that area. We can also use blanking panels. If you've ever set foot in a server room or a data center, you've probably seen a lot of cases where in a rack of equipment, if you don't have something slid into one of those areas in the rack, you can have blanking plates that you put there instead. Now, why would I do that? Well, you do that not just for aesthetics, it's really more about controlling airflow. We want to optimize airflow. Again, we don't want to mix incoming cool air with warm air that's being exhausted. Now, if you think about it, when things overheat, when digital equipment overheats, what happens? Let's take a server for an example. So the temperature is too warm in the server room. What's going to happen to the physical servers? They're going to get hot. Now, what that means, that translates to the server throttling the CPU, slowing it down. Because the faster you run a CPU, the more power you draw, the more heat you generate as a result. So one way to cool things down, modern systems will automatically slow down the processor. That means a performance degradation. That might set off alarms with intrusion detection on the network and waste everyone's time. And if it gets really bad, it could be to the point where equipment starts shutting down. That's a loss of availability, and that's part of our security CIA triad. We don't want that to happen. So even though it seems like this is mundane and it's just physical warm air, cool air, it can have an enormous impact on your digital environment. So let's take a look at this in a diagram. What we're talking about are hot and cold aisles. In our diagram, and this is in a server room, we've got a raised floor with perforated floor tiles. Now they're perforated because we are feeding cool air, shown here with blue arrows from an air conditioning unit, into the raised floor, and then it has a way to get to the equipment that needs to take in that cool air. Most equipment has intake fans that is used to draw in the cold air, and also exhaust fans that are used, as you might guess, to exhaust the warm air from the device away from it. Now, also notice in this diagram that the blue arrows are being fed into equipment racks. Now, on the other side of those equipment racks, where the exhaust fans are for equipment, that warm exhaust air, shown here with red arrows, is contained with air containment panels. Think of it of like having a closed off tunnel only for that air to be drawn over to some kind of a cooling unit or perhaps to be exhausted outside of the facility. So hot and cold aisles could show up on the Security Plus exam indirectly as a way to ensure that your data and your IT systems are highly available. Finally, you need a way to be able to monitor things like temperature, pressure, humidity, noise, proximity of equipment, such as in an industrial computing environment, using monitoring software. If you don't have a way to monitor that there is an imminent problem with servers shutting down because the temperature is too hot, You're only going to know about it after it's too late. So we now know then that hot and cold air control is absolutely paramount in making sure your systems are kept running at optimal performance and that they are kept available.